Hello, and welcome back to, or if you're here for the first time, welcome to Epi-Center. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for sticking with the series on comorbidities in epilepsy. In our last episode, we focused on ADHD in epilepsy. Today, we're continuing with the second part of what we'll call the cognitive and developmental group of comorbidities. This time, our focus is on autism spectrum disorder, what it is, how it looks when it co-occurs with epilepsy, and why this overlap matters. So, let's start from the ground up. What is autism? Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental condition that affects the way a person communicates, relates to others, and experiences their environment. It's called a spectrum because it can look very different from one person to another. Some autistic people may not speak at all, while others might talk a lot but find it hard to follow the back and forth of conversation or pick up on body language. Many autistic people show strong patterns of behavior, things like repetitive movements, very intense interests, or a need for predictable routines. Sensory differences are also common. Bright lights, loud sounds, scratchy clothing, things most of us can shrug off, can be deeply overwhelming. On the other hand, some autistic people seek out sensory experiences, like spinning, tapping, or moving back and forth. The important thing to remember is that autism is not a single picture. Some individuals need very little support, while others require daily help across all areas of life. But what happens when autism and epilepsy come together? In people with both conditions, autism often shows up differently and more severely than in most people with autism alone. Families often notice that developmental delays are more obvious, and sometimes skills a child once had, like using words, making eye contact, or playing socially, are lost right around the time seizures begin. This can be devastating for families who suddenly see a change in their child's development. Children with both autism and epilepsy are more likely to be minimally verbal, and they're more likely to need higher levels of support in everyday life. Parents and clinicians also report more behavioral challenges, things like hyperactivity, irritability, or intense meltdowns, which can be tied not only to autism itself, but also to seizures and the side effects of seizure medications. Sensory difficulties may also be heightened, so a child who is already sensitive to sound and light might struggle even more with the overstimulation that seizures bring. In certain epilepsy syndromes, like infantile spasms or Lennox-Gastaut, the risk of developmental regression is particularly high, which amplifies autistic features. So how is autism in epilepsy different from autism in the general population, especially in kids? Well, when we look at children who are autistic but do not have epilepsy, there's a very wide range. Some are highly verbal and independent, while others have significant disabilities. But when epilepsy is added to the picture, the balance shifts. These children are much more likely to be at the higher support end of the spectrum. They are more likely to have little or no speech. Intellectual disability is more common. Social reciprocity, the ability to share play, to initiate a conversation, to keep that back and forth going, is often more severely affected. And their families report more frequent meltdowns, greater difficulty with transitions, and a higher need for daily assistance. This overlap is not rare. About 10 to 12% of autistic people also have epilepsy, and that number climbs to about 1 in 5 when intellectual disability is also present. On the other side, about 6% of people with epilepsy meet criteria for autism. But in some epilepsy syndromes, those numbers skyrocket. For children with infantile spasms, about 1 in 5 will also be autistic. In Dravet syndrome, almost half. For context, in the general U.S. child population, autism is about 3%, so this overlap between the two conditions is far above the average. When it comes to treatment, the principles for epilepsy are the same. Seizure medications, sometimes diet therapies like the ketogenic diet, sometimes devices or even surgery. But doctors tend to be extra cautious when autism is in the mix. They often start low and go slow, because children with autism may be more sensitive to medication side effects, especially behavioral ones. Some seizure medicines can increase irritability or aggression, which can be especially hard for families already coping with behavioral challenges. Others are usually gentler behaviorally, but come with their own risks, like skin rash. Meanwhile, autism supports run alongside. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, structured education plans, sensory accommodations, and caregiver training are all essential pieces of care. The real challenge here is coordination. Families often have multiple specialists on board, and the goal is to make sure that what helps seizures don't make autism traits worse, and that autism support doesn't clash with seizure care. So, where does the research stand? Honestly, there are big gaps. We know epilepsy and autism share pathways in the brain, but we don't fully understand why some autistic kids develop seizures and others don't. We also don't know why seizures seem to worsen autistic traits for some but not others. Clinical trials for seizure medicines rarely analyze autistic subgroups and almost never measure outcomes that matter most to families, like changes in sleep, mood, or sensory behaviors. Another open question is what to do about brainwave abnormalities in autistic kids who don't have seizures. Do you treat them? Do you leave them? The science isn't clear yet. And finally, we lack strong tools to predict which children with autism are at highest risk of epilepsy, which leaves many families anxious about the future. All of this paints a picture of complexity, but also of opportunity. The overlap between autism and epilepsy is too significant to ignore. Better understanding could not only improve seizure management, but also transform daily life for families who are often navigating both conditions at once. That brings us to the end of today's episode on autism and epilepsy. What we see here is a powerful example of how epilepsy doesn't exist in isolation. When it overlaps with developmental conditions like autism, the challenges become more layered, but so do the opportunities for understanding and support. By learning more about how autism presents in epilepsy, we can push for better treatments, more coordinated care, and more compassion for the families navigating both. In our next episode, we'll shift to the final part of this developmental group, looking at learning disorders and intellectual disability in epilepsy. These are equally important, and together they round out the picture of how epilepsy can shape development and daily life. Thank you so much for listening. If you found today's episode helpful, please share it with a friend, a family member, or even on your socials. It helps spread awareness and grow this community. And of course, I'll see you next time as we wrap up this developmental series by talking about learning disorders and intellectual disability in epilepsy.